Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our Tropical Weather Outlook video for today, June 26, 2024. As you can see on the title thumbnail, we have a lot to talk about today, especially because we're now watching the Caribbean potentially, both in the Western Caribbean and potentially from the actual MDR as well. We have activity that, as we expected, closing out the month of June and heading into July, it seems like we're being put on notice. So let's get started by the National Hurricane Center showing those two areas of interest. As of the 8 a.m. advisory, we have first our area of interest in the Western Caribbean. This is associated with Invest Area 94L. This has a 20% chance of formation over the next week. Still a little bit of uncertainty whether or not this will actually be able to get its act going and potentially develop, but I could still see potential impacts either way in the Caribbean, and if this does develop, it probably still has a chance in the Gulf of Mexico. But this is one area of interest, and this is tagged Invest 94L, so this does have special interest for sure. But I think the bigger concern now, especially because of model uptrends over the last day or so, we're now watching an area in the central to western MDR. And I did expect that at this point, and I think we all expect that at this point in time of the season, especially in the early season, we do sometimes, especially in these really active seasons, sometimes we do get chances of development to occur in the main development region in the early season. In this case, it is late June. We saw that last year as well, but this year is still late June, and it seems like we have a chance for potentially something to occur. And this might be a concern of interest for those, especially in the Windward Islands, as we head later into the week this week and into early next week, although we'll go over model guidance in just a moment. But let's see where our two areas of interest are on the satellite right now. A wide shot of the Atlantic. You can see all nice in true color. This is what the satellite image is. It's the true color satellite imagery. And you can see this is our first area in the Central and Western Caribbean, Invest 94L. You can see there's some convective activity associated with it. So there's definitely some energy associated with 94L. Once again, the biggest thing is whether or not this is able to stay north enough that it will not be completely suppressed into Central America, which in that case, it'll not really have much of a chance to develop. But there is still some model signals from this, especially the European ensembles still think that this has a chance to try to get going in the Bay of Campeche if it makes it far north enough. So we'll watch this area. It is Invest 94L after all, and we'll take a quick look at it as well. Actually, I have a satellite image of it right here. Invest 94L, once again, you could closely see convective activity. This definitely does have, it kind of goes through phases sometimes throughout each day where it doesn't have as much convective activity, but then it starts gaining more convective activity. It really depends on how much well this convection persists. And once again, obviously interest for Central America as well, because it'll be, I think, a big key as to whether or not the high pressure to the north of Invest 94L was to completely suppress this over Central America, or, as I once again mentioned, will this have a chance to potentially consolidate some in the Bay of Campeche. Once again, regardless though, interest in Central America should watch potentially for heavy rains and that kind of stuff. Once again, I mean, it's impacts. There are definitely impacts that are expected for this for sure, whether or not, regardless, I should say, of whether or not 94L will develop. But obviously, as I mentioned, and as you can definitely see by the thumbnail card, we have a lot more than just 94L in the Caribbean right now. We got to focus our attention as well to the MDR, and you can see there is some pockets of energy we have. There are some tropical waves in here, but especially it takes interest for this. I think it's this tropical wave right here, as marked by the National Hurricane Center. We're going to have to watch these tropical waves because over the next several days, it looks like as they traverse further into the MDR, and once again, as they get closer to the islands, they might try to consolidate, and we might see potentially some sort of tropical system form late this week into early next week. And you can actually see with the tropical wave that we're monitoring in the Caribbean right now. I was actually going to show a tweet. But anyways, here's the 850 millibar vorticity. And there you can see both features, and you can actually see the wave that we're monitoring with the 850 millibar vorticity definitely shows up enough, meaning that there is definitely energy that the wave has to work with. Let me really quickly go back to this satellite image. Let me actually close this out. But you can see right here, I think it's this wave right here, there's definitely noticeable vorticity associated with this. And it's just a matter of how much convection it has and whether or not this will actually able to organize enough that it consolidates and potentially becomes a tropical system. But there's definitely some energy in the eastern MDR. Models are all picking up on it. And of course, you could also see the energy associated with 94L as well. You can see the vorticity in the Caribbean. So these areas, both, they're just not like model signals. They're actual areas that are active in the Atlantic right now that are not yet developed, but models are both potentially hinting at the potential that these might go on and try to consolidate some as we head towards the end of the week. And I found this interesting as well, and this is for the MDR system, so this is this area right here. I found this tweet by Michael Fisher explaining that a recent ASCAT pass shows an elongated but closed circulation associated with the tropical wave in the eastern North Atlantic. And he mentions while model guidance has been fairly supportive of tropical cyclone genesis, the deterministic models haven't been as favorable outside of the GFS, although as of right now, I think this might have changed because the European is starting to show development as well in the MDR, although we'll go over that in just a moment. But bottom line, what he's basically mentioning is that as we showed with the 850 millibar vorticity, with this wave that we're watching in the Eastern Caribbean, there's spin to it. You can definitely see it reflected in the 850 millibar vorticity. And it also does look somewhat compact too. And he's showing that from an actual satellite perspective with ASCAT, which measures what the winds look like on the surface from a satellite shot. He shows that indeed there is a circulation associated with this system. So it's definitely trying. We definitely have, the kick associated with these storms that we need to watch in order for development to occur. And I think the bigger portion of the story, I think, is also the sea surface temperatures too. This is the sea surface temperature map across the MDR, and especially the central and southern MDR. Notice just how warm we are, especially as we head into the Caribbean. The Eastern Caribbean, solid markings of 28, 29 degrees Celsius, but I think especially up to around, I'd say, 12 or 13 north, there's solid 26 degrees Celsius temperatures at least. And we all know the threshold for development that we typically look at in terms of tropical cyclone development is 26 degrees Celsius. And as long as this system stays at a very southern latitude, which it will, as it traverses the MDR, it definitely stays in that solid pattern of 26 and 27 degrees Celsius waters, and then it dramatically increases as we get closer into the Caribbean. I mean, we saw the sea surface temperature anomaly map. We know that the Atlantic is very, very warm this year, and we could definitely see that reflected in the sea surface temperature map of the general MDR, not just the Caribbean, although if you want to see the Caribbean as well, just, gonna try to show both. As we mentioned, these waves will potentially develop in the MDR, and then they might be a concern for the Caribbean. And once again, throughout the entire Caribbean, it honestly, and I'm not saying that any of these waves will, and I'll show you why, especially in just a moment, but the Caribbean is already supportive of a major hurricane. I mean, just take a look at how warm it is. 29's widespread as a solid sort of average throughout the entire Caribbean, and even into the Gulf of Mexico as well. Although, as we talked about earlier, the Gulf of Mexico will always be suitable, even in the early season, no matter what, for tropical cyclone development, and it'll only get warmer as well. So this is definitely interesting too. But the Caribbean is very, very warm. So I think the biggest point is that there is absolutely an abundance of energy for these waves to work with, and they'll also be small too. So it'll be interesting to see how much these waves get going. But as I did mention before, even though the Caribbean is very warm, there's also an aspect of climatology when it comes to tracking, especially these early season tropical waves potentially developing into tropical systems too. I mean, it's already kind of abnormal of climatology that we're seeing this kind of development in the MDR this early. But there's also an aspect of climatology as well. I think it really lies in the trade winds, and I'll show you that. I think the GFS, the 12Z GFS, represents that perfectly, and a nice segue too to kind of hop into the model. So let's see what they show for the 12Z. There, first of all, you can see the energy associated with 94L. The GFS is once again kind of showing the scenario where 94L doesn't really develop much because it stays very centered over Central America and doesn't really have much of a chance to develop. And then by the time we get into early next week, that system is already basically well into Mexico, and there's really not much else that there really is to speak of when it comes to 94L. And then you could see by Monday, you could also see the GFS shows one of our areas of interest, because the GFS actually spins up multiple storms, but you can see there it is. Our tropical wave that we're watching in the MDR by hour 120. So this is exactly 5 days out. GFS showing what seems to be probably a hurricane. Let me actually really quickly check. Actually 996 millibars, but moves into the Caribbean, maybe becomes 988. So I guess that's like strong tropical storm, borderline hurricane that moves into the Caribbean. But one thing I do want you to pay attention to is, look, as it enters the Caribbean, starts moving so fast that you can see it eventually it disintegrates into an open tropical wave. And notice with the system that it has behind it as well, the GFS actually shows another system. It is very interesting. That too also becomes pretty decent as it enters the Caribbean. But notice as well, into the next 10 days, this is out by hour 240, notice how these waves come into the Caribbean, strengthening potentially, but then once they reach the central Caribbean, they just automatically disintegrate and open up into tropical waves. And I think that and let me show you again with the second wave, I think that really puts into perspective the aspect of climatology that both of these waves have, especially in the Caribbean, because even if things are favorable this time of year, as I did mention, the GFS has two systems for one, which is definitely very interesting. And it kind of highlights as well the bias that especially models like the GFS have to sometimes tend to overdo these kind of situations, especially with these very small tropical waves. And that especially applies for, as I mentioned, the climatology part, because the Caribbean, especially this time of year, tends to have very strong trade winds, sometimes super strong. I can remember back to Tropical Storm Elsa when we had in 2021, and there's actually been several comparisons to these waves on Twitter so far, or at least the modeling for these waves. Elsa moved so quickly in the Eastern Caribbean. I think it was moving as fast as 30, even 31 miles an hour, because of how fast the trades were. And that is a testament to climatology of this time of year. So there's and I say that because the Caribbean is very warm, but also if you look at other model signals as well, quite a bit of modeling, especially from the European, is pretty aggressive, especially with this wave as it enters the Caribbean. But I do want to make you aware, yes, either way, this will probably be something of a concern for potentially the Leeward Islands or the Windward Islands as a whole, as we head into later this week into early next week. It especially seems to be early next week around Monday, so around 5 days out. So early next week, when the islands need to watch out. But after that, especially due to climatology, and you can even see by these wind bars here, notice how straight they are, one, but you also notice all these lines too associated with these wind bars as well, which represent the surface winds are very strong. Once again, just because of the natural strength of the trade winds this time of year in the Caribbean. I say the uncertainty when it comes to what exactly happens with these waves, there's still very much there. And actually, before we end off, I really quickly want to show the European too. Only goes out to 96 hours, but at least one thing I will mention is that both generally, I should say, all of the models are starting to show some sort of signal up here in the MDR. Or they're generally agreeing that we might have something, because this is the European on Sunday, and you notice too, the European too is starting to develop. You could see, especially by the closed isobar signature, that definitely looks like a developing tropical system later this week into early next week in the MDR. That a model like the European is showing potentially as well. So we have that, and we can even take a look at the CMC as well. The Canadian is also showing that too, and they also have a pretty aggressive sort of signal into the Caribbean. And I think actually the Canadian kind of moves a little slower as well with this system too. So we'll see. But the Canadian also has a strong signal, just like the GFS, heading into the Caribbean. And once again, as I mentioned, with those sea surface temperatures, especially them, as we head towards the Caribbean being 27, even 28 and 29 degrees Celsius in some areas, if these waves are able to consolidate enough, it might be a concern that we might need to watch that a decent tropical storm, in the very least, might be on the outlook, if you will, for the Caribbean islands heading into early next week. But in general, as I did mention, and we did talk about for quite the past few days now, these kind of signals were starting to pop up on the models, and it was expected that things would get more active as we head into early next month, which is starting next week. And we're starting to see that play out in real time now, almost, but we're generally starting to see that in real time. All the models are beginning to pick up on systems, on potentially these signals that we have, that'll put the Caribbean on notice for throughout the next week. And I think the biggest thing now is just seeing exactly how these signals play out and what kind of systems we get out of these areas of interest. All things that we'll see revealed to us, I'm pretty sure, within the next several days. So, with that being said, going to end it off for today. Really not much else to really talk about that much besides all the model signals we have right now, because things are still in the 5 to 7 day time frame. It's not like we're expecting everything to occur, especially by the time this gets into the Caribbean. That's really only going to be early next week. And believe me, in the hurricane tracking world, 5 days is a lot of time for things to change. So we might even see even more things change between now and then. So I wouldn't get too tied up on both of these areas, especially the area in the MDR. But I would say, and once again, I do stress the fact, and I'm probably going to put it in the title for this video as well, is that these are areas of interest that are putting the Caribbean on notice, and regardless, we should watch, and we definitely will over the next several days. All right, so with that being said, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw today, I always encourage you, as always, every single video, to like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, shoot them in the comments of this video, and I will try to respond. And also let me know what you think as well. Nice to hear other opinions too. With that being said, have a great day, a blessed day, stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we'll do all this again tomorrow.